Next up, I am thrilled to welcome Anita Bhatia, Deputy Executive Director at UN Women with the portfolio of resource management, UN system coordination, sustainability and partnerships. In this discussion, we're going to discuss how gender-sensitive mechanisms addressing the needs of women and girls can save lives and protect livelihoods across all sectors. We shared yesterday that nearly 11 million jobs held by women disappeared between February and May due to the global pandemic, with economic, social and health impacts hitting women the hardest. So a very warm welcome to you, Anita. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. How are you doing?
I am very well, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate you being part of the Women and Work Summit, so thank you.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure.
So Anita, I'm jumping straight in.
Yeah.
How has COVID-19 affected progress for women and gender equality in general, particularly on the sort of economic angle?
So, not surprisingly, the word is badly. This is the year we're celebrating 25 years of the Beijing Platform and Declaration. And so we had already at UN Women been looking at how have countries been doing. And we had reports from 170 countries telling us what they've achieved in the last 25 years. So already at the beginning of the year, we were looking at these reports and saying, yes, we see there are improvements in some areas for women, particularly improvements in maternal mortality, access to health, access to education, but on a whole range of issues, including women's representation, leadership, but especially economic empowerment, there just hasn't been enough progress. There's been some, but it is remarkable in how many countries women still can't own assets, in how many countries women still don't have access to the internet, to financial resources, that they're discriminated against when it comes to leadership positions in either business or government, severely underrepresented in parliament, 25% only of all parliamentarians worldwide, and less than 10% of heads of state and government in the world are women. So already we were looking at this. And then the pandemic hit, right? And then when the pandemic hit, things just got so much worse. And they got so much worse because they hit three areas. The pandemic hit three areas where women are disproportionately either represented or affected. So those three issues, I would say, are income, health, and security. So income, not surprising, because many of the sectors that were affected by the pandemic are heavily feminized. Many of them have a very high percentage of women working in them. Health, because for two reasons. One, because most frontline workers are women. 80% of nurses in the world are women. So these are the people who are getting exposed to COVID daily, right? And then the other issue on health is because all health systems all over the world had to redirect resources to COVID. It meant that regular women's issues such as reproductive and gynecological services, access became really difficult, right? And then security has to do with the fact that, the rise of violence against women, which we've been documenting since March, just shot through the roof. So the pandemic, long answer, has been terrible for women. Terrible, because it has actually also increased the care burden. Because with everybody locked up at home, guess who's doing the housework and guess who's taking care of the children's homework, right? So all in all, I think it has had fairly devastating consequences for the economic situation of most women, whether in the formal sector or the informal sector.
And I know that you just released a report on the impacts of women following COVID-19, and that also highlighted that women are more likely to experience extreme poverty, and the gap has widened. Can you share a little bit about that research?
There are a couple of reports. The one that just came out a couple of days ago, which UN Women did and co-authored with UNDP, actually shows that 47 million women are going to fall into poverty because of the pandemic. And so, yes, 11 million, you mentioned 11 million, but that was in a certain time period. But if you look at the overall composition of, how many people are going to be in poverty, it's very high. And so that's something to be concerned about. And then before the pandemic, we were already seeing that although there were women who were getting more access to education and going into, getting college degrees, this wasn't necessarily translating into female labor force participation, meaning they weren't getting jobs, right? And so this was already a puzzle in some countries, and the pandemic has just, we think, made it worse. And we already know from previous crises like Ebola, for instance, that when women stay at home because of a public health crisis, they do not go back to the workforce in the same numbers as they had been before. So a lot of different ways in which this is really impacting women's economic lives.
So focusing on solutions and the future, what steps can we take to activate economic progress for women?
So this is something we're thinking a lot about. And we think that the path to changing this really lies through the realm of public finance, right? Which means governments have a really big role to play. And that means that every country's policymakers, as they are thinking about the fiscal stimulus packages that governments are managing, have to focus on these packages with a gender lens. So they have to make cash transfers available to women. They have to find a way to find women in the informal sector, many of whom, in many countries have no identification. They have to make sure that they are working either through the state and with employers to offer sick leave, paid leave, unemployment insurance, and that the loans that many businesses are getting should focus on small and medium-sized firms as well, because most of those are run by women. And so there are a number of things that governments can actually do to make the transition back a little bit easier for women. And there's one big thing that people haven't really paid enough attention to in the past, and that is the burden of care. And nobody, really costs what it costs a woman to take care of so many things in addition to her own work, right? Somehow that is taken for granted, right? You're going to spend all those extra hours, right? But no one's actually paying you for it. And before the pandemic, women were doing 3 times as much unpaid care work as men. And we now know through the pandemic that women have been carrying a very big burden of this, They're carrying the world on their shoulders, actually, when you think about it. And so this is not an individual household issue anymore. This has got to be a matter of public policy. Governments have to pay attention to this and find a way to compensate for that care burden.
And Anita, some countries are taking measures that are gender sensitive, and some I think seem to be working. Are you able to give some examples of what some countries are doing that are sort of where you can see progress in this space, whether it's through stimulus or other measures?
Well, people are doing, they're adopting all kinds of innovative schemes. For example, in Togo, right? In Togo, the government made a decision that a large part of its cash transfers were actually going to go to women. Second, they made a decision that because they didn't want the public health crisis exacerbated through, possible virus transmission through cash, that they would do all payments digitally, right? So this also meant more inclusion of women because they were using mobile phone systems and mobile telephony to get money out, right? And a big part of the beneficiaries of that were women. So, we have seen some innovative measures like that. We're seeing, for example, in India, right, which has a digital identification system, the government was able to identify women who should be receiving cash transfers. And so something like over 200 million women got cash payments that they might not have had they not had digital IDs, right? It's funny, the pandemic you know, and the economic crisis that it precipitated actually has shown you which countries were strong before and which ones had structural inequalities. It's as if somebody shone a light on a body and you see the skeleton and you see, was it really weak? Was it strong? And where it was strong, the responses have been stronger. And where it was weak, it has just, you know, really shone a light on those weaknesses.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I guess it's not surprising, but it's probably even more stark now.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
And you touched on, obviously, there are some sectors that are heavily focused on women already. What can we do across sectors and industries to help women reach economic parity?
I mean, so for some sectors, for example, tourism, right? I mean, this isn't, here I would say, you know, until travel picks up, there's not a whole lot that you can actually do, right? Because this is dependent on so many other things. But in general, because this crisis is so different from others, right? It's both a supply shock and a demand shock. You can't fix just one side. So you can open businesses, but if women have to stay at home and take care of children because they're not going to school, you're not going to get people coming in to shop, right? For instance. So actually, the public policy interventions have to be directed towards solving for this care issue that I mentioned earlier. That's a big area of public policy intervention. And with that support, and with support in terms of unemployment insurance and leave, so that women have more flexibility, you will be able to get women back into the labor market and back into work.
We've got one question from the audience, Anita, before we wrap this up. Angela, if you're there, we will go to you.
I'm here.
Hi, Angela.
Hi. So my question, first of all, thank you so much for this thought-provoking conversation. I have to tell you, it's amazing what you're all doing and that you remain hopeful in the face of such what seems overwhelming issues. And so in addition to the pandemic, political strife and climate change have created an acute and growing refugee crisis. How do you see the impact of the refugee crisis on women specifically, and also the solutions? And are the solutions different?
It's a great question. And, you know, I think refugees, well, a very large proportion of refugees, as you know, are women and children. And so policymakers do have to pay attention to the special needs of women, women refugees. And that requires actually very enlightened public policy, because first, leaders have to keep borders open. Because you have had a situation where women have been turned back, migrants and refugees have been turned back from borders, right? Because governments have shut down because of the pandemic. And so they have really been trapped in this twilight zone where they are not able to go into the country and they are not able to go back to their home countries, right? We've seen this in a lot of migrant workers. And so I think public policy does require taking a more humane approach to the issue of refugees and finding safe ways to cater to their needs. Remember, in most refugee camps or areas where refugees live, it is very hard to do social distancing. It is very hard because of the lack of physical space to actually be healthy and safe. So, you know, this is something that only a government can solve, right? This is not something where you get the private sector. Of course, they can have a role, but this is principally an issue of public policy. So, you know, first is recognizing that it is a problem, and second, being willing to take not a selfish, but a humane approach to solving the problem.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And Anita, just to wrap up, what steps do you think we can collectively make to power forward into 2021? And how can we as leaders in this community use some of your information and stats and and reports to help impact the women and create impactful solutions?
I think what's really important is to advocate for having women at the table. The idea that decisions are being made now, which affect the lives of so many women and girls, in most cases not involving women, is just not on. And when you look at who's actually making decisions, and if you turn on the television and you see, it doesn't matter where it is, in most countries, the decision making on these issues is not being done by women. And there are just not enough women at the table. And where you do have women in leadership positions, you have actually seen a much better response to the pandemic. So whether it's Germany, Taiwan, Finland, New Zealand, that is a model of enlightened leadership. So we have plenty of evidence that having women in decision-making roles actually substantially affects not just their health, but also poverty levels. And so, this is really a matter of life and death, right? So I think one thing that everybody should be advocating for is having women at the table, having women be a part of decision-making structures, and then also raising the issue of care, of the care economy, and lobbying governments and other decision makers for action on the care economy.
Anita, thank you so much.
It was my pleasure.
That was a wonderful conversation and very practical as well. So thank you, and thanks for all the work that you're doing, and wishing you the best of the luck with the next few months.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, and good luck to you for the rest of your conference. Great to be with you all. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye.